Welcome to the Gregarious Mammal Podcast. This is Kris. I've got a little special episode here for you. These are two interviews I did at Collision in New Orleans earlier in the year. And I'm going to focus on software foundations. And I have an interview with Brian Behlendorf of the Hyperledger Foundation and an interview with Kris Borchers of the JavaScript Foundation. Now, unfortunately, the press area, or in fact the whole venue at Collision, was not great for recording. There's a lot of background noise. I have done my best to remove as much of it as possible, but there are definitely certain places where it's going to be hard to hear what people have to say, but I thought it was worth leaving in. And there are certain places where I have just cut it and jumped in and filled in the gaps. So I hope you stick through the whole episode and listen to the interviews because they were quite interesting, but I do apologize again. And hopefully the Collision venue next year in Toronto instead of New Orleans is a little better set up for audio recordings. So first up, this is Kris Borchers.
Kris Borchers. I work for the Linux Foundation, and currently my time there, I'm 100% working on the JS Foundation. So I'm executive director for the JS Foundation, which our sort of mission, our goal is to support key JavaScript projects, open source JavaScript projects, obviously, throughout the ecosystem. And so it's everything from some of the old tried and true, like jQuery is one of our projects, to a lot of the sort of newer tooling and workflow things like Webpack or things like that. So, yeah.
And how long has the JS Foundation been running?
So that's an interesting question. So we're actually the JS Foundation was a relaunch of the jQuery Foundation. All right. So if you go back to that, I always blank on this day. I want to say we formed the jQuery Foundation in 2012. And then in October 2016, we had already grown. I mean, we had a number of projects kind of start up the jQuery Foundation beyond jQuery. In early 2016 or late 2015, we actually absorbed the Dojo Foundation, and so we brought in Dojo and but a lot of tools. So a lot of tools that are being used. So like Lodash was part of that, Grunt, things like that. So those all came in then, and then in October 2016, we relaunched as the JS Foundation. Brought in a few more projects. That's when Webpack came in. IBM brought in Node-RED. Samsung brought in JavaScript, which is it's a really interesting. It's a JavaScript engine for memory constrained devices. So JavaScript engine for like running on microcontrollers and. I don't think they use it in Tizen that I'm aware of. They are doing some work with some of their Arctic devices. But where we've seen, so JavaScript actually ships on the new Fitbit Ionic and Versa. And so that's what enables, if you want to build apps or clock faces for those devices, you just write them in SVG, CSS, and JavaScript. And JavaScript is the engine that enables that.
Yeah, just a little bit, because I saw your talk yesterday, or your panel yesterday.
Yep.
And actually, so you previously used to be involved a lot more with jQuery, and I think, and jQuery is, it's to me, it's like PHP. It's got one of those, these days it has one of these bad reputations, purely because it's been around for a while. Right. But actually, I still think it's wonderful because it's one of those technologies that brings a lot of people in. And okay, it may not be the best, but it's easy for people to get started, and then they go and discover other things. It's like, I actually was teaching beginning coding with Ruby on Rails to people, and we discovered that Ruby on Rails is terrible to teach to beginners because they don't understand the pain yet of what it solves. So, and sometimes things like jQuery and PHP are good to start, and then you realize, bringing in this huge library for a couple of small things, maybe it's not worth it. Right. I'll go and look at some other stuff, but you don't actually know what the problem is until sometimes you've experimented with that. But so, what was your involvement with the jQuery project at JQuery Foundation, whatever your involvement was?
Sure. Yeah. So, no, I mean, I guess first to your point, I mean, jQuery, it is not the cool kid on the block anymore, but it's still, I mean, if you look at like builtwith.com, I mean, it's still on something like 20-ish% of the internet. Like the 80% of the top million websites still use jQuery.
Probably with WordPress.
Well, yes, exactly. And so WordPress does, I think, push a lot of that continued usage. And then, yeah, I mean, even if you look at our CDN that StackPath provides for us, it still averages something like 17,000 hits per second. And that's just our CDN. And then there's a Google CDN, and there's all the others. And then there's the people that are just running it on their own servers. So it's still being used. But no, my history, So
this is unfortunately one of the points where the background noise is way too loud to hear some interesting points. So I'll quickly jump in here. Kris talks about how he was a webmaster, if you remember that word, at a university, and first discovered jQuery, got involved with contributing to jQuery UI, and did a lot of bug fixes thanks to the bug bounty program they had at the time. And as a prize for fixing one of those, he went to one of the jQuery conferences, and from then on got sucked into the community. And now I will let Kris
went and got a job at Red Hat, running the JavaScript team on a mobile project called AeroGear, which is still around but very different than what it was when I was there.
Red Hat is slightly different.
Yeah, so when I was there, the idea that we were exploring, because at this point it was still, there was no product around it. It was just, let's build something and see what happens. And so the idea was, it was to be a framework for developers. It had its own sort of JavaScript framework, Android framework, iOS framework, but we worked really hard to keep the APIs as similar as possible, in an attempt to have development teams be able to sort of speak the same language to each other, but then build in the native language for the particular solution.
And there was a whole plethora of these sorts of technologies. This is kind of where I got more into doing a lot more community work, was actually with the beginning of, as was then, iTrophy. And I ran a mobile meetup, and we covered jQuery mobile. Sencha.
Oh yeah.
Titanium Accelerator, all these sorts of technologies.
Yeah.
They're all getting somewhat superseded for good and bad.
No, absolutely. And so those were a little bit different. So what we were not going for that sort of single code base and deploy. It was more, your team would still, the JavaScript people would write JavaScript, the Android people would write Android.
Right.
But they could, the libraries themselves had very similar APIs within the confines of the language differences. It ended up, it didn't end up becoming anything. They sort of pivoted that and started focusing more on like unified push messaging stuff, and then they acquired Feed Henry, and that kind of kept in that sort of like more like server-side focused push messaging type thing. That was after I left. So while I was on that team, ended up finding my way onto the board of directors at the jQuery Foundation. For better or worse, it worked out good for me. In hindsight, we learned that promoting developers to your board was probably not the best way to sort of strategically run an organization, because no one really had experience in actually running a business.
Can we just code stuff again?
Yeah, exactly. But it worked out for me, because I was on the board, and then when the current executive director decided to go on to another opportunity, I threw my hat in the ring and got the job. So
I mean, back in the days of the jQuery Foundation, I guess there were probably less mature JavaScript projects to consider. But, the cliche with JavaScript these days is there's so many frameworks. I've covered a lot of the Linux Foundation and non-Linux Foundation foundations.
yeah.
Like the Cloud Native Foundation, the Hyperledger Foundation, of course, and several others. And with those, often it's a much more niche area, and it's probably easier to pick some of the projects. But with the JS Foundation, there are so many JavaScript frameworks and projects. How do you even decide what should be included or not?
Sure. So there's a bit of we have a process. So any project can apply to join. We have a repo under the JS Foundation org on GitHub, and it explains the application process. But it's basically just filling out a whole bunch of information about the project and really explaining to us what your goal is with the project in terms of growth and community building, because that's where we can help. We do not employ developers to write code on your project or anything like that. Our goal and the point of our mentorship program that we have is to help projects put policies and procedures in place that we have seen over time are conducive to building a healthy community and not relying on sort of that single individual or single organization to keep a project going, and sort of more like diversify that committer and contributor base, so that if the company that maybe started the project decides, we're going to move on, there's still an entire community that will keep it running for the large group of people that still use it.
And in a similar vein for JavaScript frameworks especially, when does someone decide that a project is time to come out? JavaScript things come and go quite quickly. Well, it appears they do. Obviously, again, jQuery is a good example of everyone ignores it, but it's still going very strong.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, so your question is like when are projects done?
Yeah.
That's a hard question. Yeah. We do have projects that are sort of on that cusp of they've been done in terms of like feature development and things like that. And use is waning, and so we've started the conversations of how do we sort of not necessarily like we would obviously never just like delete a project, but how do we sort of denote that this project is just done and no longer being supported? And we have other projects that are for all intents and purposes done. So example is Require.js.
Yeah.
So it's done. James Burke is the guy that does most of the development on that still. But he's not, as far as I know, really adding features or building anything new. He fixes bugs, especially things that are critical, because there is still a really wide, really large user base for that project. But it's done. And so that is a conversation going on in our technical advisory committee right now, is how do we sort of label, for better or worse, these projects to inform the ecosystem sort of where they're at without sort of like writing it off, right? Because we definitely don't want to say like stop using Require.js, because there are still very valid use cases for a project like that. But we also want people to know that like if you want new features, it's likely not going to be implemented unless you do it yourself.
Yep. And I get the impression, especially in the JavaScript world, that there might be some, in quote marks, competing foundations is Node? And
Yeah.
I mean, you have something like Node, which I think has its own foundation.
It does.
But it's a huge project. And you have something like React, which is huge, but I doubt Facebook is part of the foundation and has their own kind of whatever.
Sure. Yep.
And lots of other, I don't know, things like Angular.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, which of the kind of big frameworks are part of your foundation versus their own kind of institution?
So I mean, if you think about sort of the big frameworks that people are using, none of them. Okay. We do have
Apart from jQuery.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, jQuery I wouldn't call a framework. I would more call it a library.
All right.
But so we do actually make sure I'm not. What time is it? Should be. Today's Wednesday, right? So Dojo 2 is being announced today, and it's a complete rewrite, all in TypeScript, all with a view toward web components. So it's actually really interesting, and I'm interested to see if it can start gaining some ground, because it will not remind you of Dojo very much. It is I would call a new framework, and very forward-looking in terms of the standards that they're following. I mean, you can take if you have sort of a web component that's been built toward the still developing web component spec, Dojo 2 will import that and you can use it. And then similarly, you can export out web components. And like I said, it's all written in TypeScript, so it's JavaScript, but you get a lot of that type safety and things like that. So I think that'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on. We also recently brought in Marco, which is a UI library, but it has sort of an ecosystem that you can use it as a framework. Originally developed at eBay, and so it's what runs the UI of eBay.com, and still does. And it's another really interesting one. It kind of takes... So if you look at like React and how they use, so they have JSX, which kind of takes JavaScript and makes it more HTML-y.
I know. I still don't like it.
So Marco went the other way, and so they took HTML and made it more JavaScript-y for theirs. And actually, I feel like I could wrap my head around that more easily, and maybe it's just me.
But I guess, so do projects end up, I mean, maybe it's not been going long enough yet, but do projects kind of almost graduate? You know, someone like Node, for example, maybe they could have been a member a few years ago and they become so large that they're actually better off setting up their own foundation.
I guess that could happen. Yeah, that could happen. So the JS Foundation and the Node.js Foundation are both Linux Foundation projects.
Oh, okay.
So we're running JS Interactive is a big JavaScript event coming up in October in Vancouver.
Yep.
And that is replacing Node.js Interactive.
All right.
And so Node.js and Foundation and JS Foundation, we're collaborating. At the end of the day, we have the same communities, the same ecosystem. I mean, they support Node, and we support basically everything else that is interested in our help. And a lot of that stuff either it only runs on Node or uses Node in its tooling or whatever. So there's so much overlap there, it just makes sense for us to be working together more and more. So,
and I mean, one of the points of foundations is often to help projects mature, get some kind of governance framework, grow the community, manage, in quote marks, the community, etc. Which, as you alluded to earlier as well, is not always first nature to, especially more technically minded people. But they have their own sort of way of self-organizing sometimes.
Sure.
So what would be, I guess, your main pieces of advice to people whose projects are kind of growing and they want to take them to the next step and figuring out how to do that?
Sure. So, I mean, that's exactly where we want to help, and those are the projects we want applying. Yeah. So, I mean, come talk to me, or at least go check out the JS Foundation org on GitHub and find that application and apply. Because you can apply and maybe we just give some advice and you decide, it's not for us right now, and that's fine. But I think as part of that process, I mean, the main pieces of advice that we like to give, and actually I think I started touching on this in the panel yesterday. I mean, one of the things that I hate that I even have to say it, but like, licenses matter.
I know, it was actually yesterday, to be honest with you, I've been one of those guilty people who's never really cared much about licenses, and the panel yesterday actually made me think, I think I need to pay a bit more attention, actually. I've always kind of been the person in the room at open source events when people start talking licenses who leaves.
No, I mean, it's a boring topic.
And I just always felt like it wasn't so constructive, personally. And also, strangely, I have tended to find Americans care about it far more than anybody else, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah, and I don't know if that just stems from... So, I mean, honestly, for me, in helping projects grow, one of the main ways that I try to help projects grow is get businesses that are using them to actually contribute to them and work on them. And those companies are not going to contribute their IP or license their IP through a CLA to a project that's using the like WTFPL or some ridiculous license or no license at all, because there's no safety there. There's no and so we, I mean, as a policy at the JS Foundation, we default to Apache 2 because it is kind of the gold standard of license, if you will. It gives you that sort of liberal flexibility of like a MIT license or BSD license, but it has the patent clause, patent licensing protection that especially large patent holding organizations want to see to make sure that there's no possibility of them violating their own patents or someone violating, just getting into this whole legal mess around patents. So
it's something I've actually started to pay more attention to, and I've worked at small startups who don't care, and then it can sting you later because you've got a dependency that is no longer maintained. I've also last year worked at an enterprise company where we had to very tediously go through every license, and there were some of these W2F licenses where the legal people were like, and it was like a dependency of a dependency of a dependency, but it was enough that the legal team would say, no, sorry.
No, absolutely. And that's where, I mean, so the folks at FOSSA, I don't know if you're familiar with them. It's a newer startup. They've been around for a while now, but they do license scanning.
I've interviewed another company that does something similar, whose name completely escapes me right now.
But yeah, so FOSSA's been great. So they give us their services for free, and we've found really interesting things. Like everything ended up being okay after some legal review and some changing out of dependencies. But I mean, we found things like incorrect metadata. So even like the like say package JSON would say MIT, but then you actually go and look at the license file and it's like a GPL3, and you're like, but like FOSSA finds that. So but that's one of the big, I guess, services we provide our projects that a lot of developers don't want to care about, which is that sort of legal angle that they don't even think about in terms of having proper licensing, making sure all of your dependencies are safe, providing a CLA so that contributions coming in are properly licensed to the project to be used. So, but yeah, so back to your original question on sort of advice. I mean, I would say licenses matter. The other big thing that we really try to instill in projects is like the short version is write it down. But the idea is in the way that your project runs, no matter how that is right now, whether it's a benevolent dictator or you have a technical steering committee or whatever, write down how decisions are made, how people can get involved, how people can work their way from filing a bug to being one of those decision makers, and give contributors as much information in that area as possible. Because developers like targets. And so if you say, when someone contributes, like, thanks for your contribution, we'd love to keep you involved, and here's how you can stay involved, here's when we have meetings, like really sort of holding their hand in that process, you get a lot more people to stick around and stay involved in the project. The idea of funding for developers for open source projects is a very valid thing. I think where my opinions differ is in the methodology. And so we've learned from experiences that directly paying open source developers for their contributions to the tune of actually, like, that becomes their livelihood, and outside of a business with other interests. So this is probably getting a little convoluted, but one of the best ways our projects have contributors that are consistent and stick around are they work for an employer that funds at least a portion of their time to work on a project. And that, to me, is one of the most ideal ways to have consistent long-term contribution. Because a business, if their product depends on that project, they are going to make sure there are people working on it. Where I get concerned with some of these crowdfunding platforms that have come up, and even the Patreon model, if you can make it work, I think is okay, because that is an individual that's saying, pay me as an individual to work on something, and I think that works. It's when you start funding a project that it in itself is not a legal entity, and in turn that project is then paying people. It just gets very murky in terms of sort of legalities and tax laws, and you're kind of trusting some people that are new to this game to actually know what they're doing, and it raises concerns to me. And even beyond all of that, we've seen in the past, I mean, we, for a while, did pay people to full-time to run jQuery UI, jQuery Mobile, and some other projects at the jQuery Foundation. And though those people did a great job, what we found was whether, and I don't think this was any sort of malicious intent on their part or whatever, it just was a natural occurrence that the focus became doing their work and making sure that they were getting things done and billing for their time, and much less focus on building a community and an ecosystem. And so when the money eventually and inevitably runs out, there's no one there to pick up the slack when those people are, well, I'm not getting paid, so I'm not going to work on this anymore.
It's an interesting perspective, actually. The multiple people doing a little bit is more sustainable than one person doing everything. This being very high-profile examples of this failing, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's yet to be seen if this works out. I mean, Webpack has been successful at raising a good amount of money and distributing it. I think it's just, I have concerns about when it's no longer a great marketing thing for some company to give them money every month and that number starts dropping, and they lose someone like Tobias, who, I mean, he's making his living off of this, and I think he might have some other contracts, but he gets paid quite well, and he's the lead, he's the original creator, and if he stops getting paid, I don't see him sticking around, because, I mean, and I don't blame these people, because they have to go find work, and so it's... We could talk for a long time on that topic, but because I mean, I have opinions, and I should say these are, for the most part, I think, personal opinions. I mean, they come from experiences at jQuery Foundation, JS Foundation, but we're still figuring out sort of a foundation sort of stance on this, and that's why, I mean, we do not stop our projects. So Webpack has an open collective, Mocha has an open collective. So like, we don't stop them from doing this, because it's not, I mean, we want them, they have autonomy within the JS Foundation. It's just, we have concerns, and so we're trying to figure out.
It's good to see your name on the list, because I went to Hyperledger meetup in Berlin last week.
And some things popped into my head at the outcome of after that. So I was like, okay, it's cool. I get to ask for it.
Straight to the source and ask for course.
So, I mean, the project has been very busy. I get a lot of emails from the newsletter, and there's always lots of talk, and there's lots of local meetups and things. But I can't remember exactly when we last spoke, but let's say it was 6 months ago, just for academic purposes. What's new in the project in the past 6 months?
Sure. Well, in the last 6 months, we shipped a production version of Sawtooth.
Okay.
It's now the second toolkit that is in production. Production grade, which means the developers are happy and comfortable with the idea of other companies and people they've never met running this to manage real digital assets, right? So that's a milestone for any project in this space. So, and now there are companies, building networks on top of Sawtooth, in healthcare, in finance, and all sorts of places. So, and across that and Fabric, which is our other enterprise platform, there's probably in the order of, not a large number, but a couple of dozen different production networks, and each of those networks being a group of banks, a group of whatever. So that's interesting, and I think we'll get to high double digit, maybe even low triple digit this year. There's quite a few of those who don't talk about what they do. Quite a few deployments of this that are behind the scenes, right? But that's interesting. And so, secondly, there's been a lot of pickup around Indy, Hyperledger Indy, which is the self-sovereign identity platform that is being built as a part of the Sovereign Network and a part of some of these other approaches to self-sovereign identity, to user-centric identity. So Indy's out, and it's still not at 1.0 yet, but lots of folks are picking it up and using it, and the Sovereign Network is running it in production, so it's starting to get some use and traction. We, in October, so quite just a little bit outside your 6-month window, but we put up a course on edX for Hyperledger that has now attracted 90,000 people. Have signed up for that and started to take that course. And so really that's just an attempt for us to kind of help the world understand this different approach to blockchain technology that isn't about cryptocurrencies and ICOs, but is about this more prosaic application of distributed.
And actually so far, I mean, this is the interesting thing, and I'll get to the outcome of, maybe less positive outcome of this soon, but with a lot of, so for example, there was a little briefing from the Joe from Consensus, who I think you were on a panel with earlier, and we talk about Ethereum. All the questions were about regulation. Is it this? You can tell it wasn't what he wanted to talk about, but it's all that ever gets asked. And I get the impression that Hyperledger manages to circumvent that conversation too much, maybe.
The cryptocurrency community are trying to do a bunch of very ambitious things all at once, right? Whether it's the world computer, whether it's a global payments platform. So I give them due credit for that. We have an easier job, which is there are existing business networks that before blockchain technology, the only way to really serve those networks was to anoint somebody as the hub and as the owner of the data. And there's some checks and balances you could put in, but whether it was in the consumer side, things like Uber or PayPal, right, or on the business side, Ariba or these other kind of like business aggregators, the technical architecture of client server ended up lending itself really well to building big, giant, scalable servers, right? And so blockchain technology is kind of finally something to return the technical architecture to where the business architecture is, which is a lot of competitive companies kind of, jostling each other with sharp elbows, but all having a common need for a common ground truth between what they do. And so we don't go in and say, you've got to change regulation to use it. We say, this is a tool for actually enforcing greater tracking and traceability. And it's, I don't like to call it reg tech, which I guess is kind of a popular thing out there. But if you want to build your KYC network on top of something like this, if you want to, implement your diamond supply chain traceability mechanism using this is a way to get there. What I hope it means is less anxiety out there about, well, how does this meet up with regulations, and maybe a way to make meeting the spirit of regulations easier for new participants. Because if it's an excuse for bureaucracy and an excuse for keeping new competitors out, that's where regulations are bad, right? That's where we all can agree it'd be better to have less of them. But if we can meet reporting requirements, if we can meet transparency requirements easily, in an automated fashion, and keep fraud from happening in the first place, then we're probably a lot better off. And that's what blockchain technology can be about.
It's actually interesting because the meetup I went to, you started half answering my next question. The meetup I went to last week, I think, the example was. It was actually weird, considering it was the Hyperledger meetup. The audience were really tough.
Sure. Well, Berlin is really full of cryptocurrency crowds. So
I know. This is the funny thing. Usually they're more pro. This crowd was. Maybe this was the issue, because there's this whole issue with that throws a lot of traditional crypto people with Hyperledger being the private aspect. And the example that the person gave maybe wasn't. I spoke to the organizer of the event the next day at another event, and she said to me, it wasn't a very good example. All the questions were basically just around that it didn't quite get the point. Like, why not just do this with a centralized server and have access to user accounts? Like, why do I need blockchain? I can do this already with 101 tools. And actually, you said it in a much better way just then in passing. Like, it changes that dynamic of having to have one person as the data owner.
Yeah, I mean, this is about decentralizing without necessarily anarchy, right? And somehow anarchy became a first order prerogative in this space, and I even think the appearance of anarchy is false, because if you look at the differences in reaction in the Ethereum community to the DAO hack and to the Parity Wallet hack, and you realize there's subjective decision-making going on and leadership and cultural differences that bailed one mistake out but not the other, right? It wasn't based on objective criteria. And so why not recognize that governance happens and start saying, how do we have governance in these networks? And once you do that, then it's a very short stretch to say, well, that governing entity looks an awful lot like a permitting entity on a permission ledger, right? Yeah. And that this is the way that most business ecosystems work. Is they're especially mature ones, especially in regulated industries. There's a set of agreements. If you're a company that wants to into the medical field, there's a set of agreements you have to agree to, right? And so I've started to use the phrase minimum viable centralization to characterize. Well, maybe let's make sure that entity that plays the role of the referee on the football field, right? Yeah. Their role should be as lightweight, as transparent, and as objective as possible, right? It should perhaps look a little bit like ICANN, right? Yeah. Where ICANN, warts and all, does a very admirable job of being the centralization. And people talk about the internet is decentralized. No, it's not. There's very lightweight centralization, very lightweight governance that kind of barely works, but it works. And ICANN, I think, has been a model for stewarding that. And if they had failed their job, the domain name registrars would have all gotten together and done an ICANN 2.0, right? And so as long as we can fire the governing entity, as long as those nodes are there because they want to do business with the other nodes, but ultimately realize they have the power and they can fork at any time, then this is as good as
it's actually a good point. Yeah, that's actually a good point. You can always the entities could always fork if they don't like. It's actually almost a better way of representing a lot of kind of corporate squabbling.
Yeah.
We don't like the way you overthink things, so we can do it ourselves.
Corporate squabbling and developer squabbling will, survive to the heat death of the universe.
Definitely.
I mean, so we still have to figure out, though, how to do business with each other. And in the open source software community, we figured this out.
I know. And it's actually something I say to blockchain people all the time. A number of times I stand in the room, it's like, we need all these mechanisms for managing decentralized communities. It's like, you don't need that. Just look at Git and open source. Like, they've been doing it for ages.
Yeah. So, and I do realize that sometimes I romanticize kind of open source out there, but partly it's because I've spent a lot of time in the Apache community and others where if you're voting to make a major decision, you've already failed because driving consensus is much less about what does 51% of the world think and much more about do we collectively as a small team who are responsible as stewards for this component or this kernel or this software release, are we agreeing that this is the right kind of architecture or wrong one, or at least having this kind of lazy consensus of people making changes, but lots of others overseeing and kind of reviewing and, there was a mistake in that, a typo in that, or it's a deeper question, having a longer-term conversation about the right way to go. But these are not 51% voting wins or losses, get in. And there's an intrinsic value to everybody working together, which is I need a better Linux kernel, I need a better web server, because I have something else I got to do. I'm not trying to make money down here. That's not why I work. And that's why, all of the permission ledgers, they don't need a token to incentivize consensus because the parties are already incented to have a high-quality ledger. And then finally, so open source worked because the license guaranteed the right to fork. It said, if we've got a project here and it's led by Linus Torvalds and it's got his name on it, and he's doing a decent job as air traffic control / chief architect / community builder, although not perfect on all of those, right? But good enough that people stick around. If he ever failed enough that the community wasn't happy with it, the community can fork, right? They can go in a different direction and essentially follow a different leader. And that is a check on tyranny. You can't fork your Uber history. Right?
No. And I used to be involved in the Drupal project, and something happened similarly. When Drupal 8 came out, a lot of people didn't like the direction, there was a fork. And then the same with Node, and they rejoined at some point when the community was.
Forks are incredibly natural, and they do come back around. And you need this Darwinian competition for resources, and so that's why I don't think we'll ever get down to one global currency. For the same reason we never got around to Esperanto, right? I'm sorry to make that comparison, but
I live in the Eurozone, so we're partially there. But
I think a global currency community made sense when exchanges across borders were challenging and people didn't want to carry lots of different currencies. But I wonder if today, in 2018, if we still had the lira and the Deutschmark and others, but people had credit cards and they were vaguely aware of currency rates, but where somebody from London, Paris would go to Stuttgart and buy something as easily as they would with cash. Would it have even would the euro matter at that point?
No, and this kind of where checks and even banknotes came from in the first place. Having a more convenient method of exchanging worth instead. There was a conference a couple of months ago in Berlin that was this whole discussion around probably more so the non-Hyperledger community around tokenizing all the things. And this conference was an example of it kind of gone too far one way. And it was just even a lot of the crypto fans in Berlin was like, what the hell are people following?
Those happen in San Francisco too.
Yeah.
There's two subtexts that I think are hybridizing here. One subtext is anger at the system, anger at the way the world works, dissatisfaction, whether it's economics or politics but a sense of disenfranchisement. And they saw 20 years ago there was a window into which a bunch of smart geeks stepped, and out came Google and Facebook. And there's a sense of a window open there that if the geeks can get in and have the right strategy, then they can become the next. So part of it is we could remake society. It isn't that glorious. The other part is a lot of people are not at a point of economic self-sufficiency right now, not at a point where they have more than a couple of months of rent saved up in their savings, if that, right? And so, to see the guy down the street who, made a lucky bet and bought, mined 30 Bitcoin on his home computer, right? And now is driving around a Lambo or something like that. There's that amplifies that anger and that sense of missing out. And it hybridizes with a lot of money that has nowhere to go in the financial markets out there, because returns from equities are down, returns from all sorts of ordinary traditional things are plummeted. And so people are looking for alpha, and alpha isn't coming from even venture capital anymore. Alpha now seems to be coming from this cryptocurrency thing. And if you can get in on the right pre-sale, if you can get in on the right, deal where the right oligarch or the right dark money is coming from the right source, then, you can gain things so that your stuff goes 100x, right? And that's an incredibly corruptive process. And these are different crowds, but they meet up at the founder CEO and the founder CTO level. And, and it might start out from very idealistic places, but it can lead somewhere dark.
The interesting thing that came into my mind was this sort of aspect of the token economy. It was I took it to the extreme as a intellectual exercise of I write on Steam and I get tokens for my work. I take those tokens to the using the supermarket token to get my food. I give them to the landlord token. I give them to the electricity token, etc., etc. And then I buy my Netflix token, my Apple Music token, my whatever else tokens, various decentralized alternatives of those, of course. And I was starting to think, is that actually convenient? Because it feels, it's just like lots of tokens you have to keep exchanging. Yeah. And then someone said to me, what we really need is a universal token. That's not going to happen. It's sort of this interesting idea.
Called fiat currency.
Yeah. If you take it to the extreme, it actually doesn't necessarily make the world
Do you view frequent flyer miles as an alternative economic engine? Or do you view frequent flyer miles as that thing that you should get around to trying to spend one day?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
The latter, right? And I still don't understand people who buy extra frequent flyer miles, because there's no way economically that works out for anybody, even at a discount. And also, and a lot of people have written about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators, right? And I think one reason why open source communities work is intrinsic motivation, right? One reason why other online communities have been a part of, want to help each other, comes from intrinsic motivator, not because they're paid per minute to be talking to you, but because they have a need, they want to serve, you have a need, you want to serve, and you meet up in the middle. And I do worry a bit about if we extrinsicate everything, right? Make everything about I do this because I can earn 5 tokens a minute doing it. We end up in a poorer space as humanity.
And it's sort of, there's been a lot of, there's this quote that keeps coming up a lot about incentivization or drive. I can't remember the exact quote, but it is by putting a value on everything, it's sort of, it does concern me slightly, because it's like ticking off the lights. It's like working through the check-ins. It's, whereas in the open source community, it was okay. You could look at your commit record, but I don't know if people really sit there looking, I want to get to that 700 commit.
The gamification of certain things, or paying little bits of things, it's really hard to say. Like, there are projects out there that are basically miniature bug bounties. I believe in security bug bounties. Like, if you find a deep security hole in this,
you have one now,
10K, 20K more, because that's almost like an insurance policy. Like, if nobody claims it for a long time, then that's probably a sign that there's fewer holes than others have, right? But I don't believe that's how you drive most of the software development out there. No. If I pay you $500 to fix a bug, then your motivation will be to fix it as expediently as possible, but not necessarily the same fix that will keep other similar bugs from happening in the future, or be understandable, or even be necessarily accepted by the upstream core developers, right? Like, what happens if you come up with a bug fix, but there's some serious isissues with it? It fixes the bug, but it introduces some others, and you submit it upstream and they don't accept it. Well, then it's no good to anybody, except maybe to claim the $500, but it's not a sustainable fix. Yeah. And so that's where payment for you can't drive all of software development through these micro kind of payments for features and bugs. It's not a thermodynamic system like that. There was a famous paper 15-ish years ago called The Physics Envy of Modern Socioeconomics. which was basically, it was a meta study, right, of all these papers out there that tried to figure out things about motivations and nudge, right, like the whole Cass Sunstein kind of thing, which I ultimately came to the conclusion that the scientists in the space want to treat it like a thermodynamic system where you can understand and model precisely the inputs and the results. And it just doesn't work that way. Human subjects are scurrilously notorious for experimenting back upon the researchers, right? All those A/B tests that people did to test consumer sentiment around advertising that they're shown. A year later, consumers have figured out how to filter those kinds of ads out and get what they want, right? So this is something that pretends to be a hard science, and it's not. And so motivation design, economics design is, when it works, it'll be interesting and amazing, but it's almost always guaranteed that your inventions will be used. If you're an inventor and you come up with something, it's guaranteed people will try to game it.
Oh, for sure.
And try to figure out the optimal path through it. And your design might take into account the happy path. Yeah. But you have to think like a hacker when you design.
This is actually a whole other topic of interest for me, this sort of ethics of tech, but also thinking about the worst case scenarios. But let's get back to Hyperledger. So actually, at this meetup last week, he demoed a composer, which I found quite fascinating because in my mind, and I've asked this to a lot of blockchain development projects, where they kind of cover the token mechanisms, the smart contract mechanisms, but I still, and I meet a lot of other developers from more traditional developer backgrounds, still struggle to figure out how to put that into something. And so what? Like, how do I get that into a front end? How do I get it into a back end? And et cetera, et cetera. And so Composer is really interesting because it actually is a tool sort of designed to help you along that path. And I know it's very sort of early days, but it was using JavaScript, I think. Yeah, not JavaScript-esque, it was JavaScript, which is even to a new developer, is a fairly easy language to get started with. Right. I heard one criticism from some people that the modeling language, the presenter said, it's for non-coders, and a lot of people like, I don't think non-coders will find it that easy to get, but early days.
I struggled with that for a while. I mean, have you ever looked at macro code inside of
a
Excel?
long time ago? Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure things like Oracle and stuff have these sorts of scripting.
And there are some people working on smart contract languages, like L4, was called Legalese. There's a company called Legalese with a product called L4 and the other way around. Anyways, it's attempting to be a smart contract code that can be read by lawyers and has the lexical complexity required and the approachability, but has the precision that allows it to be turned into executable code.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess when it comes to, it's Composer, isn't it? Not Composer. How successful has it been in getting people actually getting applications to, at least to testing?
We've heard good things. It's hard to draw metrics from this because we don't require people to register when they use this stuff, when they deploy things. I know there's hackathons that now this becomes the standard tool for getting average devs kind of, they don't have to learn about a lot of the back end. They don't have to stand up their own network. They can just say, here's Composer, design it in this, and out it pops an Angular.js based front end. And it's a great way to bootstrap. There's a lot more to do there. Being able to auto deploy to n number of clouds, or add in support for other distributed ledger systems. I mean, I would be happy to see it support not just Fabric, but also Sawtooth and Ethereum and others, because, I think diversity right now is helpful. Diversity, we need more ideas and more challenging of each other to be better. And DNA mixing as well, to help improve all these things. So Composer as a pipeline to bring in new devs who eventually might scratch below the surface and do more things.
You invariably have to once you've used one of the system tools anyway. It takes you 90% of the way, and usually the remaining 10% can take just as long. But
right.
It was a cool looking idea anyway.
Cool. I'm glad the demo.
It's something that I've struggled with so many times.
Well, we have to get it out of the coins as the end result. Exactly. It's the end result has to be some problem being solved. And I think there'll be lots. on stage, I was asked, "Did you see either of my kind of talks?" Or
I think I've been in a bit of a haze today, and I only just looked at
a lot of the questions were like, "Well, how is this going to be real for end users?"
Yeah.
And I had to say, most of the time, this is about business-to-business connections. This is going to be about, I hope it means greater auditability, less fraud, and less risk.
Yeah.
So maybe things like insurance rates come down or something like that. But like ultimately, fee costs for bureaucratic processes hopefully means less dumb paperwork having to fill in the same form over and over. But ultimately, this is still pretty back end. And what I hope Composer showed was that you can be building an app and not even know that it's blockchain stuff behind the scenes.
Exactly.
But just know you're tapping into a network where there's shared state, shared ground truth.
Exactly.
And that's the important thing.
And there's a lot of big businesses coming on board with various blockchain technologies, including among them many, but most frequently, quite often, Hyperledger. How many do you know of any of, or you could say, of course, any of these companies yet that are moving from just testing to actually having production applications?
Yeah, we've got on our website kind of a part of our tracker, which is here's the stuff that we know about that's been publicly announced in production. And whether production or late stage pilot, I think we're tracking about 24 different production networks out there in healthcare and in finance predominantly. And then, what we don't have is a coin market cap where you can hit reload and see like,
Which is probably a good thing.
Probably, but it makes it hard. Makes it hard to make it. Like I said, this is the dark matter of the blockchain space, and so we know people are downloading and using it. We know we're getting bugs that are the kind of bugs you would only see in production systems. It's pretty impressive. So.
And thank you for listening. These two interviews were part of a general article on DZone about open source software foundations. So have a read of that. Will be in the show notes. On those aforementioned show notes, you can find them at gregariousmammal.com/podcast, and you can support the show at gregariousmammal.com/support. And you can find it on Facebook, facebook.com/gregariousmammal. Talk to you next time.